Good morning and welcome to Audiobooks All Day. This will be one of my favorite episodes just because this was one of my favorite books. We've talked in the past about expectations with books, and sometimes you go into a book with expectations and sometimes you don't. This was a book I knew nothing about. Today we are covering The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. And I cannot tell you how much I didn't not know one thing about this book. Not one thing. All I knew was H.G. Wells, whom I love, but that was it. And so I started listening to it, and I was taken on the adventure of a lifetime. So here's my caution. If you have actually not listened to this book on Audible, don't listen to this podcast. Stop it right here. Come back to it after. You will thank me. It was amazing. For those of you who are still here, though, we're excited to break it down.
Absolutely. And The Island of Dr. Moreau is by one of our favorite authors, H.G. Wells. You know, one of the front runners of science fiction. And it was first published in 1896. So H.G. Wells, if that sounds familiar, also wrote other books like The Invisible Man and The War of the Worlds. Check out our episode on The War of the Worlds, and the Invisible Man episode is coming soon. But H.G. Wells is one of our favorite authors, and like Jeff, this is one of my favorites.
So I'm just going to kind of spoil everything. Dr. Moreau is like literally what I texted Kevin while I was listening to it saying, this is probably one of the most messed up books I've ever listened to in my life. And I think too, because like I wasn't expecting it. You know, H.G. Wells does such a good job at, you know, like this first person narrative, which is how this book is written. But essentially, this book is about a guy who is ostracized from medicine in England and science in England because he liked to experiment on things while they were alive. Pretty much, this doctor has set himself up on some random island and has been conducting experiments on animals to try and make them more human. This was something that I have his primary motivation. Dr. Moreau's primary motivation was to understand the laws of nature and see how far they could be altered. That is pretty messed up. Specifically, he was obsessed with the idea of transforming animals into humans through painful and gruesome procedures. That was the book. So why did I like it? Because I did not know that was what the book was about. And it was so scary. But the book is actually written from somebody who winds up on the island very randomly.
Right. He lands there. He gets there by accident. He was in a ship that went down, picked up by a different ship that is dropping off a bunch of animals to the island. And the captain on the other ship throws him off. And so he's now on the island. And he's a scientist of some sort. Doesn't really get into
biology.
That too much.
Yeah, he's like a biologist.
Yeah. So, you know, he's kind of slowly starts figuring out, and it's pretty messed up. Like, you know, Dr. Moreau, he just starts, you know, carving things up, putting it back together, try to make him more human, and he starts to create. When Prendick, that's the character from whose perspective the story is told. When he first get there, he starts seeing these people. He's like, something wrong with that guy? He looks strange. We're like, those people kind of look like pigs. And so he starts to meet these people who are these animals that have been essentially tortured into this new form. And many of them have they can speak, they've gained a sapience, or that is, you know, beyond their normal capabilities. And he starts interacting with them, and it's really kind of freaky.
Yeah, and you know, eventually he runs into Dr. Moreau. He winds up taking him in, and then that's when he starts to find out more about his experiments. You know, and then he runs away because he's obviously worried about having experiments now be on him. And then that's when he starts to get like introduced to Ape Man and Sloth Man, and you know, he gets introduced
Dog
to this
Man.
village of these, you know, near human animals, where they, you know, have these rules, they have these, you know, these different things. And really the difficulty of the main character is he just wants to survive. Like at the end of the day, like it's not necessarily his vision to, you know, to be some sort of like warrior or some sort of like justice seeker. He really just wants to survive, and he's just really scared.
Yeah. He's just terrified because, there are these animals who are, wild, dangerous animals that are now a little bit smarter. And Dr. Moreau is nuts. And his assistant, his name, I keep forgetting his name. Dr. Moreau's assistant. It's not Maddox. It's
Montgomery.
Montgomery. Montgomery. He's a drunk, and he was a doctor, and he was kicked out of London. Essentially, he was ostracized because he was a drunkard, and so he's completely alone, and he's very scared. They one thing that I really disliked Dr. Moreau for, obviously the horrible experiments, but once an experiment was done, he just took the animal and pushed him out the door. He's like, all right, this isn't quite there. I learned some lessons, and then he just throws him out. He says, bye, slams the door on him. And so you just have these animals who create like this village who kind of view him as their creator, their god, but also are very confused because he just kind of throws them out. He tortures them and tortures them and tortures them, changes them, and then leaves them. And so as Prendick starts interacting with these animals, he's like, these guys are weird, and they have their own like weird tribe culture, and they have all these laws. They have these laws, and they chant these laws, and most of them are nonsense. But one of the big laws, that's Dr. Moreau's laws, that he says like he incorporates in them. So through the torture, somehow, he doesn't explain how, but he brainwashes this into him, is that they should never taste blood. Dr. Moreau believes that if they were ever to taste blood, that will start to lead them to degenerate back to their animal forms the quickest.
And it actually starts to happen. So it was interesting because there was a point in it where Dr. Moreau, he creates like this half puma woman, and she escapes, and then Dr. Moreau and this puma woman fight, and they actually wind up dying. And that's actually where I thought that the book was going to end for some reason, because I'm like, oh well, now Dr. Moreau's dead. So I'm like, oh okay. But no, this guy's still trapped on the island. And I was like, this is so interesting. Like, in so many stories, right, you're building up to where the bad guy dies. But that's not how this story goes. The bad guy dies, and you still have like half the book left. So then he literally spends months with these beast creatures, and he's just noticing that so many of them are starting to revert back. And he had this really like Dogman was his really like most faithful companion. He gets killed by Hyena Man, and then he has to shoot Hyena Man and all of this stuff. It's like there's a lot of stuff, but he starts to see this, each one of these animals really start to revert back, and so his safety is constantly more at risk. And then it was kind of interesting because like eventually he like looks out at the shore, because he's wanted to escape. He like made a raft, and it sank, and he even said like, I'm glad that it sank in the beginning, or else, because it would have been really not great to be out there and then have a sink in. But like he looks out and he just sees this rowboat, and there's just a bunch of birds around it, and he sees two people in it. And then as they get closer, he realizes that they're both dead and that the birds have been eating them. And so then he kind of takes this moment to like, escape. He had to kind of go around the island. It's a little bit of a longer story, but he winds up, just pulling out. Now he's at sea again. So this is like his third time, because the first time he was shipwrecked, then he was marooned, and now he's just out in the middle of the sea. And then he gets lucky again and gets picked up. And then all of the people on the ship kind of pull a Frankenstein, where they pull him up on the ship, and they're like, well, what happened to you? And he starts telling this story, like this crazy story. And they're like, oh, you're crazy. And nobody really ever believes him. And then he just winds up, going back to England. He just feels like people will revert to animals, and then he just moves out of the country and just finds some solace there. But like, I really liked the book so much for that it didn't just like build up to some random climax, because like there was still a situation that he was in, and that's so much more realistic. Like, I mean, not that this story is realistic, but just like, you like, not everything ends neatly, and I like that.
It's funny because so much of literature today is trying to shock you, because so much has been done, and most of it was pioneered by these, not most, but a lot of it was pioneered by these early fantastic science fiction authors. And so many books today are just trying to find things to shock you and to bring you and to find something new. But this book, published in 1896, defied so many expectations. And I think that's one thing that made it so memorable and so fun, because it was like, just like it didn't stop where it was supposed to. It didn't start where it was supposed to. It wasn't told the way it was supposed to be told, but it just kept going, and one of the things I love, you mentioned it. So Prendick, when he's on the island for months, and first, Prendick's not really the good guy either. He's not a bad guy, but he's not a good guy. Like, he doesn't try to help the animals. He's scared to death of them. And so when Moreau dies, he's like, just like Moreau changed your forms, he's gotten rid of this form. He's coming back. Moreau is God. He's come back. And I am, he didn't say I'm his prophet, but he essentially said, like, respect me because I am a human and he didn't say I'm his prophet, but that's essentially how he set himself up. He's like, and he didn't want to be the overlord or anything. He just wanted to survive. He wasn't trying to help. He wasn't trying to teach anybody math. He wasn't trying to teach people how to read. He just was like, I just need to get out of here. And he makes the comment, that as he's on the island, because Montgomery also dies soon after Dr. Moreau does. And so he's alone with these animals. And that at times he starts, even as they're reverting, he starts to see their state as normal and how that really bothers him because he doesn't see the strangeness of it. And then, and it's not to see them as like, oh, they look the same as humans, but as their behavior as human, even as he knows that it's getting less human. And then, like you said, when he gets back to England, he starts to see the animals within the people and starts to wonder, will there be a day where we will all revert back? Like, it's talking about like what is holding up our society from reverting back to a more bestial, a more animal time. And it's just really, it's like that kind of thought, like that's really creepy. That's kind of scary. Like, that's a thought that sticks with you.
No, H.G. Wells is just amazing because his main characters are not like the big studs. They're not like the people that go in and they are totally normal people. That's why I love War of the Worlds so much. It's just like that random person, that's like out in the crowd. It's just like, it's just a story from that guy. And same with him. Like, he's just trying to survive. He's just, and then he's trying to deal with all these things. I think that my favorite quote though from this whole one, oh, by the way, he does say, because of all of this craziness, he's like, I must confess that I lost faith in the sanity of the world. I could understand that. My favorite quote, though, comes, I hope or I could not live. And so there was like this, it's crazy how we as humans just like have this mad hope to just continue to exist. But like for H.G. Wells to like write so many different wild books, he's very, very talented. And I just really enjoyed this book. Totally subverted all my expectations because I had none. And it was, it really was a powerful book. It was, I felt like I learned a lot. I was very entertained, but it was pretty disturbing. And, you kind of wonder, like, how'd you think of this book? Especially like back then, like now we have so many different inputs that can help give us ideas, but back then they didn't, so how was he just sitting there thinking, maybe I'll just put some messed up doctor on an island and this dude will see him, it's just like, how'd you think of that? It's pretty wild. But anyway, I loved it.
Well, genetic engineering is such a hot topic today, about everything that's coming out there. And it's like, this book was written over 100 years ago. And it's all about, many people would say, it's a cautionary tale about genetic engineering. Way before we even came close to having even the idea of the science of doing genetic engineering. And just, the cool thing about science fiction, right, is that, it's funny because like when we reread Planet of the Apes, right? Planet of the Apes, the author, one of the things I noticed is that the future was essentially just the 1950s with space travel, right? Because it was written around that time and it was just pretty much the same, but slightly different. But in H.G. Wells, he really pushes out and says, I'm going to take science and I'm going to create, we're going to move stuff now. And we're just getting to some of the scientific discoveries that he was discussing in the 1800s. And, it's really interesting to start to see some of these things come to fruition.
Yeah, so I mean, I would totally recommend this book. Totally go listen to it. It was very fun, from one of our favorite authors, and I think that you will wind up learning a lot. So thank you for joining another episode of Audiobooks All Day.